Mississippi, Mississippi. What do I have to do with that state? Absolutely nothing. My great-great-grandfather, Thomas Brooks, he didn't plan to visit Mississippi either. In fact, no black person in the 1800s or even the 1900s wanted to go there. Thomas Brooks was born free in 1846 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. To be born free means his mother was a free woman. In 1854, at 8 years old, he and his mother, who was heavy with child, went behind their house, close to the alley, and they were tending their chickens. But the sound of clip-clop of a horse, the jingle of the reins, the creak of a wagon, alerted Thomas and his mother that they were not alone. White men grabbed them, bound and gagged them, and threw them into a holding cage inside the wagon. Kidnapped, stolen, snatched. They took them to a basement of a house. They were there for 3 days. The men came back and took my great-great-great-grandmother away. She had lost her mind, worried about her baby and her other children. Thomas never saw her nor anyone else in his family. The men shipped Thomas down to Natchez, Mississippi, most likely by steamboat. There was a flea market, not for goods, but for people, black men, women, and children, sold as property at Fork of the Road Slave Market in Natchez, Mississippi. Thomas survived slavery, the Civil War, and post-Civil War era. Here is this mulatto boy. Here he is. He's nice and strong. Look at his teeth.
Boy, it's hot out here.
$350, $400. Okay, sold to the man in the red hat.
I was born on the river in a little tent.
With their maize, they're working out sharecroppers.
Oh, and just like the river, I've been running ever since. Hey, Lucille, bring me some lemonade. Oh, I'm sorry, master.
In 1870, the first census that included blacks shouts at me. That flat piece of paper bursts with story. Our ancestors wanted us to know about them. Thomas lived in Natchez as a farm worker. Joe Thomas was a farm laborer and he valued education because his daughter Miranda Thomas, age 17, went to school. Most black teenagers in 1870 were farm laborers or maids. Miranda was enjoying the blessings of the Reconstruction period. I'm proud of her. Charlotte Green was the head of the home at 65 years old. Thomas must have loved Charlotte. Perhaps she took him under her wings when he was sold into slavery. He named his first child after her, and this child became my mother's great-grandmother. Charlotte died giving birth to Viola, my grandmother. Each decade of the census, Thomas named several different states as his birthplace, from Mississippi to Maryland, and finally on the last census before his death, Pennsylvania. Why? I can't answer that question. Would you pay $2,000 or more for the right to legally marry your sweetheart? That's what Thomas Brooks did. In 1871, he decided to legally marry Miranda Thomas. He paid a fortune for that right to have a marriage certificate. $200. It's not a typo either. It's spelled out in all caps. $200. This document sings of Thomas Brooks' character and deep convictions. $200 in that day is like $2,000 today. That $200 investment reveals his deep conviction concerning marriage, and it tells me that 6 years after the Civil War had ravaged the South, he had money. Today, it costs $21 to buy a marriage license in Jefferson County, Mississippi. Thomas and Miranda had 13 children, of whom 8 survived to adult. Thomas died somewhere between 1917 and 1919, and the family migrated to Memphis and on to Seattle. After several years, they moved to Oakland, where my mother, Beatrice Winchester, was born to Jack and Viola Winchester. Viola is Thomas's granddaughter. Both of my mother's parents died from TB, one when she was 3 and the other at 5. The Great Depression made life difficult. Times were hard. My mother and her sister lived with various relatives, but finally, Jack Winchester made a decisive decision and asked Mr. and Mrs. Lake to raise 2 of his girls, Betty and Viola, who was also nicknamed Doll. Mr. and Mrs. Lake agreed. They had one daughter, Marjorie. On the census, Betty and Viola were listed as boarders. The Lake family was known for their work for people in need. Mrs. Lake was related to Billy the Kid, and she passed for white when she wanted to do so. In my mother's heart, the Brooks family died, and the Lakes became her family. John Theodore, he came from Mississippi and married my mother when she was 18 years old. 9 months later, Malvern John Theodore was born. My mother stated on the marriage license her mother's maiden name, unknown, birthplace, as California. Once again, I realized my mother continued to cling to Mrs. Lake as her birth mother. On my mother's birth certificate, her mother's maiden name was Brooks. 9 months later, Malvern John Theodore was born. John Theodore wanted my mother to return with him to Mississippi to live. Would you return to the South in the 1940s with your baby? She said no. That was the end of that marriage. 9 years later, she married my father, Earl Youngblood. Their certificate of marriage continues to tell me that my mother had erased her birth mother from her heart, for it showed maiden name and birthplace for mother unknown. Yet both are on my mother's birth certificate. Including my brother Malvern, my parents had 6 children. I did not grow up with these stories of my great-great-grandparents ringing in my ears, because my mother felt abandoned by the Brooks clan. She, at the tender age of 5, turned her back on them. In her heart, she adopted the Lake family as her real family. I and my siblings believed that the Lakes were our grandparents and their daughter Marjorie, our blood aunt. Any Winchesters or Brooks we met, we thought were close friends. Thus we called them uncle and aunt. Whenever I had to write my family tree for school, I met with a wall of resistance from my mother. I tried to connect the dots, but could not. We didn't ask questions because we had been painfully taught not to get into grown folks' business. Well, that door to the past cracked open in 1975 when I applied for college at UC Berkeley. I wrote my mother's maiden name down as Betty Lake. She corrected me and said her name was Beatrice Winchester. I could not ask questions. I really wanted to, but my training kicked in and I remained silent. When she went to the restroom, I did study her birth certificate, which had to be included with the application. I saw her parents' name. I was stunned. Decades later, I finally learned this history from Barbara Thomas, a cousin I met at my Aunt Doll's funeral. She invited me to the yearly Brooks family reunions. I was amazed. Cousin Barbara is a wonderful genealogist, and she has spent decades collecting our family history. Because of her dedicated work, the door to our past is now wide open. Thank you so much, cousin. I told my mother the story of Thomas and Miranda, and she was astounded. In 2012, she finally attended the family reunion. In 2009, my husband Randy and I decided to find out another clue to our ancestors' identity. My mother's maternal line began in Nigeria with the Yoruba tribe and the Fulani tribe. And this was after taking a DNA test with AfricanAncestry.com. My mother, age 88, died February 22, 2013, and was buried at Evergreen Cemetery next to my father, towards the back of the cemetery. On the front side of Evergreen, Mr. and Mrs. Lake, their grave lay close to Miranda's, born a slave in Mississippi. The circle of life, complete. In that summer of 2013, I began a book about a 12-year-old girl living in 1964. In what state did she live? Mississippi, of course. And which meant that in 2018, my husband Rand and we actually went to Mississippi to do further research on that book. And we followed the civil rights and the blues trail. And we invite you to visit Mississippi too and discover the indomitable spirit of Black Mississippians. These following words my mother Betty Youngblood wrote September 12, 2003. To my children, I love all of you so much. So happy with my children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and my children's spouses. My ring and jewelry are Valerie's. I hope nothing but happiness fall for all of you. Do the right thing. Believe in the Lord, and you will be happy. Treat others the way you want others to treat you. Love you, Mom.